The line formed before dawn, when the sky over New York City was still the color of bruised steel and the wind cut through coats that had already been worn thin by better years. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, hats pulled low, eyes fixed on the pavement as if ashamed to meet the morning. Some had once owned shops, others had worked the rails or the factories along the Hudson. Now, in the winter of 1931, they waited silently for bread. Frank Callahan tightened his scarf with stiff fingers. 2 years ago, October 1929, he had stood on the floor of a brokerage house near Wall Street, watching fortunes rise and fall in numbers that felt unreal. When the market collapsed, the sound was not a crash but a long, sickening silence, followed by shouting, then panic. By 1930, the shouting was gone, so were the jobs. "Any left?" a man near the front asked the volunteer behind the table, his voice barely louder than the wind. "Not much," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Frank thought of his wife Anna back in their cold apartment on the Lower East Side, boiling potatoes again because meat had become a memory. He thought of his son's shoes patched twice, now leaking slush. Around him, the city breathed in hunger and exhaled despair. This was America, rich in promise, poor in mercy, and millions like Frank were just beginning to understand how quickly everything they trusted could vanish. By 1932, the factories along the river stood silent, their smokestacks like broken fingers clawing at the sky. Frank walked past locked gates and peeling signs that read help wanted long after the paint had faded, as if the words themselves were ghosts. Across the nation, nearly 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed, but numbers meant nothing when hunger had a face. In Chicago, in Detroit, in towns scattered across the Midwest, men rose each morning with nowhere to go. Women stitched and restitched dresses until the cloth gave up. Children learned new games, counting pennies, sharing a single apple between siblings, pretending not to notice the hollow ache in their stomachs. "I used to build cars," a man told Frank one afternoon at a soup kitchen run by a church on Bowery Street. His hands shook as he held the bowl. "Now I stand in line for soup I didn't earn." "You earned it," Frank replied quietly. "This country took it from you." Pride was the first casualty of the Depression. Families sold wedding rings, violins, war medals. Veterans of World War I slept under bridges, their service forgotten by a nation struggling to survive itself. Newspapers spoke of recovery and patience, while eviction notices nailed shut entire lives. At night, Frank listened to the city coughing, crying, praying, and wondered how a land built on hard work had run out of work entirely. The knock came without mercy. In the spring of 1932, landlords and marshals moved through neighborhoods like a slow, relentless tide, carrying papers stamped with the authority of a system that no longer cared who drowned beneath it. Furniture piled up on sidewalks, beds, dressers, cribs, entire lives exposed to the open air. Children watched from stoops as strangers walked past their broken worlds. Anna stood frozen as the marshal read the notice, his voice flat, practiced. "You have 1 hour." Frank said nothing, he only nodded. Words had become useless things. By noon, their apartment on the Lower East Side was empty, their possessions stacked like evidence of failure. Neighbors gathered silently, some whispering prayers, others turning away because tomorrow it could be them. Across the country, these scenes repeated themselves. In Cleveland, families pushed handcarts filled with scraps of their former homes. In California, migrants fleeing dust-choked farms slept in makeshift camps, tents stitched from flour sacks and hope. People called them Hoovervilles, bitter monuments to President Herbert Hoover, whose promises of recovery rang hollow against the sound of empty stomachs. That night, Frank lay awake on a church basement floor beside dozens of others. Someone sobbed quietly in the dark. Someone else whispered, "We didn't fail, the system did." Frank stared at the ceiling and wondered how many Americans had to lose everything before the nation remembered them. Hunger learned the shape of a child's face in 1933. It lingered in schoolrooms where teachers brought extra bread in their purses and pretended it was leftover lunch. It echoed in playgrounds gone quiet, where children no longer ran but sat on steps, conserving energy their bodies could not spare. In cities and rural towns alike, childhood shrank under the weight of survival. Frank's son Tommy stopped asking questions. He accepted thin soup without complaint and learned to say he wasn't hungry when there wasn't enough. Anna watched him carefully, measuring his ribs with her eyes, her heart breaking a little more each day. He should be growing, she whispered one night, not fading. Across America, schools became feeding stations, churches became lifelines, and mothers skipped meals with practiced smiles. Doctors reported diseases once thought conquered, rickets, malnutrition, tuberculosis, returning quietly, shamefully. Newspapers rarely printed photographs of starving children. The truth was too cruel, too close. One afternoon, Tommy tugged Frank's sleeve as they passed a bakery. "When this is over," he said softly, "can we buy a whole loaf?" Frank swallowed hard. Yes, he lied, because hope was the last thing he could afford to take from his son. The Great Depression was not only an economic collapse, it was a theft of innocence. And in the silence of hungry homes, a generation learned that America's promise could disappear, even from the smallest hands. In the heat of summer 1932, desperation gathered its courage and began to march. From every corner of the country, veterans of World War I rode freight trains, walked highways, and hitchhiked toward Washington, D.C., carrying little more than bedrolls and memories of a war they had once fought for their nation. They called themselves the Bonus Army, demanding early payment of bonuses promised for 1945, money they needed now, not in some distant future that felt like a lie. Frank read about them in a crumpled newspaper, then watched in disbelief as photographs appeared. Thousands of former soldiers camped along the Anacostia River, living in shacks made of scrap wood and tin. Men who had worn uniforms now begged Congress for mercy. "We didn't ask for charity," one veteran shouted during a rally, his voice raw. "We earned this." President Herbert Hoover refused. Fear of unrest hardened into force. In July 1932, U.S. Army troops led by General Douglas MacArthur moved in. Cavalry charged, tear gas filled the air. The camps burned, flames devouring the last shelter many veterans had left. Frank folded the paper slowly. "They fought for this country," Anna said, her voice shaking, "and this is how it answers them." The message was unmistakable. If America could turn its back on its soldiers, it could turn its back on anyone. And for millions watching, faith in the government cracked, another casualty of the Depression, smoldering quietly in the ashes of broken promises. By 1934, the earth itself seemed to betray the farmers of the Great Plains. Years of drought and careless plowing had stripped the soil bare, and the wind came like a curse. Walls of dust rose across Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, swallowing houses, fields, and skies in a choking darkness. They called it the Dust Bowl, but there was nothing small about the suffering it carried. Frank met one of them at a relief center in New York, a man named Eli with red-rimmed eyes and a voice rough as sandpaper. "The dust came through the cracks," Eli said, "through the windows, through the doors. We stuffed rags everywhere, but it still found us. Crops failed, livestock died. Children wore damp cloths over their faces just to breathe. Families packed what they could into broken trucks and headed west toward California, chasing rumors of work that often vanished on arrival. They were labeled Okies, spoken with contempt as if poverty were a crime. These people used to feed the country," Anna said quietly after hearing Eli's story. Frank nodded. "Now the country won't feed them." The Depression was no longer confined to banks and factories. It had sunk into the soil, risen into the air, and followed Americans wherever they fled. The promise of the land, once sacred, had turned to dust, and with it went the certainty that hard work alone could guarantee survival. Hope returned not as a miracle, but as paperwork. In March 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took the oath of office amid a nation exhausted by despair. His voice crackled over radios in living rooms, shelters, and breadlines alike. "The only thing we have to fear," he said, "is fear itself." For the first time in years, Americans leaned closer, listening. Frank listened too, standing in a crowded relief office as a clerk stamped forms for the Works Progress Administration. Jobs, real ones, began to appear, building roads, painting murals, repairing schools. The pay was small, but it was pay. Dignity returned in modest installments. "I'll be laying bricks," Frank told Anna that night, his voice unsteady with something like pride. "It's not Wall Street, but it's work." Yet the New Deal did not reach everyone equally. African American workers were often the last hired and the first fired. Women's labor remained invisible, unpaid, expected. Migrant workers were excluded from protections. In the South, segregation shaped who received aid and who was left waiting. Still, something had shifted. The government, once distant and silent, had finally acknowledged suffering. It did not erase the scars, but it slowed the bleeding. And for millions like Frank, it proved that survival, however fragile, was still possible in a nation learning painfully how much its people mattered. Even as jobs returned, the shame did not leave. It clung to people like a second skin, quiet and heavy. Men who had stood in breadlines now avoided eye contact, afraid their past hunger would be recognized. Women who had stretched meals with water and prayer still saved crumbs, unable to trust abundance. The Depression changed habits long after paychecks reappeared. Frank noticed it in himself in 1936. He worked steadily now, helping repair roads outside the city, his hands calloused in an honest way, yet he still counted coins twice, still felt panic when the cupboard looked thin. "We're safe," Anna would say gently, "for now." Across America, thrift became a moral code. Nothing was wasted. Children were taught to mend before replacing, to save before spending. Laughter returned, but it was cautious, as if joy itself might be taken away again. "I don't ever want to go back," Tommy said one night, older now, his voice carrying memories he should never have had. Frank placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "That's why we remember," he said, "so we don't forget how close we came." The forgotten victims of the Great Depression were not only those who died of hunger or exposure, but those who lived on changed. The nation would recover economically, but emotionally it carried the weight of loss forward, shaping a generation that learned survival before it learned trust. By 1939, headlines spoke less of hunger and more of distant tensions overseas. Europe was drifting toward war, and America watched cautiously, still bruised, still tired. Factories that once stood silent began to hum again, not with consumer goods but with the machinery of defense. Steel returned to the rails. Orders returned to the docks. Recovery arrived wearing the uniform of necessity. Frank noticed the change in the city's rhythm. Men walked faster, whistles blew again at dawn. Yet beneath the movement there was restraint, a collective memory whispering, "Don't trust it." Families hesitated to celebrate. They had learned that stability could vanish overnight. "We're working again," Anna said as they listened to the radio one evening. "But it feels like we're waiting for something." They all were. The Depression had taught Americans to expect loss, to prepare for collapse even in moments of progress. When World War II finally pulled the nation fully back into production, it did so on the backs of people already hardened by years of sacrifice. The forgotten victims faded from the newspapers, but not from the streets. Old men still slept lightly, mothers still saved jars and scraps, and in homes across America the Depression lingered, not as a headline but as a lesson etched into daily life, quietly shaping how a nation faced the uncertain future ahead. When the Great Depression finally loosened its grip, it did not end with celebration. There was no single day when Americans declared themselves healed. Instead, the suffering faded into memory, into habits passed down quietly at dinner tables and in half-spoken warnings about waste, debt, and trust. The forgotten victims were not honored with monuments. They lived on in silence. Frank grew old in a country transformed by war and industry, yet he never forgot the winter mornings in breadlines or the sound of boots during evictions. When prosperity returned, he welcomed it carefully, like a stranger who might leave without warning. "We survived," he would tell Tommy, now grown, "but survival changes you." The Great Depression reshaped American history not only through policy, the New Deal, labor protections, Social Security, but through its people. It altered how Americans viewed government responsibility, economic risk, and community care. It proved that unchecked systems could fail millions and that dignity mattered as much as dollars. The victims most often forgotten were the ordinary ones: fathers who swallowed pride, mothers who hid hunger, children who grew up too fast. Their suffering never made headlines, but it built a quieter legacy, one of resilience, caution, and hard-earned empathy. And long after the markets recovered, their stories remained. reminding America of what happens when prosperity is taken for granted, and how much it costs when a nation forgets its own people.